What I'm going to do is to try to drill down a little bit onto focusing on the social safety net that's targeted at families with children or children. Number one, just the starting point is they're the demographic group, at least age-wise in the United States, that has the highest poverty rates. And number two, as raised earlier, children are uniquely suited to be thinking about in terms of issues around intergenerational mobility and what it means to have low incomes at this age and the potential returns from doing more spending and investment. So what this does is just a static calculation, no behavioral change, starting from the baseline of all programs intact for children. And then one by one, we just zero out each element of the social safety net and just ask the question, how many more children would be poor if we did that? Number one, the most work towards reducing poverty in our social safety net comes from the tax credits, more the EITC than the refundable child tax credit, but we'll just call them the tax credits, and then also SNAP. And if I were to show you this graph looking at deep poverty, the incidence of having after-tax and transfer income below 50% of the poverty line, SNAP would jump out. And actually the second largest anti-poverty program for deep poverty in America for children is actually Social Security. Little known fact. You don't see TANF on this list. It's there, it's in other benefits, but it's very small. I think it's 0.2 or something like that. So even deep poverty, our current quote unquote cash welfare system is doing very little. The earned income tax credit and the child tax credit are work condition programs. Many of the programs on this list, as Jesse sort of mentioned earlier, have a lot more work contingencies in them than are obvious from the outside. If you look at the graph on the right, you'll see that in 1990, on the first year on this graph, 70% of the social safety net targeted at children went to families that didn't have earnings. And what you see at the end of this period is that that has basically reversed. Another way, though very related way, to look at it is to say, where in the income distribution are these dollars going? And so the graph on the left does that exercise, though it cuts it off at 200% of poverty. And what you can see there is that essentially all of the growth in our social safety net over this 25-year period is going to the more advantaged part of the disadvantaged population. I did some work that looked at the Great Recession as an opportunity to quote unquote stress test the social safety net. And one of the things that jumps out of that is that we did very well at sort of income protection around poverty and levels and above that. So for example, in Jason's graph that he showed us at the very beginning, where we had this huge increase in market income poverty in the Great Recession, though we didn't pay a lot of attention to it, it was quite flat on the supplemental poverty measure through the Great Recession. Like, that's an incredible success that our social safety net provided that protection. But if you kind of dig a little deeper and look further down the distribution, there was more vulnerability and more of a sort of response of deep poverty and below than we would have predicted from previous cycles. So there's clearly less protection at the bottom. Part of that is targeting at work, and part of that is a bit more than that. What could we do to reduce child poverty by half, starting with the system we have right now? And so we did one simulation in our National Academy of Sciences report that was focused on a work-only set of policies. Minimum wage, EITC, and some other things, and we couldn't get there. So what these two simulations show you are two different ways to try to get to a 50% reduction. And the first column uses pre-existing policies. So essentially expands out-of-work assistance through SNAP and through housing vouchers. And the one on the right brings in a child allowance. And so think of a child allowance as being an extension of the current child tax credit, which gives $2,000 per child up until about $400,000 a year, as Jesse pointed out. So think of the child tax credit or a child allowance as basically extending that child tax credit, expanding it a little bit, but going all the way down to zero earnings. And that Canada implemented a child allowance a couple of years ago, the Canadian Child Benefit, that's on track to reduce child poverty in Canada by half. It's about 6,000 Canadian dollars per year, is paid through the Social Security system on a monthly basis. So it's sort of complementary to the lump sum benefits that many people really appreciate and like about the Earned Income Tax Credit. And then what both simulations share is an expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit. Also, something we haven't talked a lot about in these 2 days is actually using the child and dependent care tax credit, which now is very tilted towards people like us in the room in our income category, and basically making that a refundable tax credit, but again, focused on, is in a way to get more child tax benefits. That also has very large earnings as well as direct impacts. And so you do that all together, you get 50% reductions in regular poverty and deep poverty at a cost of about $90 or $100 billion per year. And it also delivers, as it turns out, net employment. Because the gains from the EITC and the expansion of the child and dependent tax care credit outweighs the negative employment effects embodied in ordinary out-of-work programs like SNAP and housing vouchers, or also the more moderate version of that in a child allowance. It's also really important to point out that when you're talking about children, it also begs one to ask, what difference does it make to be doing more, quote, redistribution aimed at children? What difference does it make to their life trajectory? We definitively have a lot of evidence that points to the importance in the long run trajectory of these programs that we have. So we've got a lot of evidence from Medicaid, an enormous amount of evidence from Medicaid that shows more access to public health insurance when children are young, not only does things in that period, but increases their human capital, increases their education and college going and earnings and health in adulthood. We've got evidence from SNAP that providing more access to resources or food that those resources purchase, particularly in early life, leads to improvement in adult health. And now we have some evidence from work that I've been doing that it also has impacts on human capital, lower incarceration rates for African American men, lower mortality rates in adulthood. Also evidence about the long run effects of the Earned Income Tax Credit and cash welfare. The real challenge with this is that when we implement these programs, the costs are super salient and they appear today. And the benefits take quasi-experimental research and a lot of time to wait for them. And I think that that challenge makes the conversation around talking about the investment aspects of these programs more difficult in practice. Thank you.